Hey, everybody. Welcome to Moderate Rebels. And we have a really important guest today, Stella Moris, the fiancée of political prisoner and journalist and publisher Julian Assange, to address the continued US and UK's political persecution of Julian Assange, who is still held in maximum security confines at the Belmarsh prison and who recently had some very significant hearings. The Biden administration is still seeking the extradition of Julian Assange. Attorney General Merrick Garland will not turn back on this case, even though it has completely fallen apart. And so we're going to address the details of the collapse of this case and the continued sadism of the US and UK establishment against the wishes of pretty much every human rights organization in the world, the UN, and every press freedom organization we can think of. So Stella Moris, welcome to Moderate Rebels. It's great to see you. How are you doing?
Thanks, Max. Well, I'm holding up, I guess.
Under some very difficult circumstances, I'm sure. But I feel a sense of hope here. I don't know if that's overly optimistic. I'm definitely not an optimist, but I feel some hope for Julian's freedom. Am I wrong to feel that way?
Well, I just think that the case, as you said, has fallen apart, and now we just see this. Julian's brother called it as a zombie case. It's in the legal process, so it just trundles along through the courts, but it has no substance to it. And it never did. In fact, the US took an unprecedented move under the Trump administration to use the Espionage Act for the first time against a publisher for publishing true information to the public. And they're doing it under the rubric of the Espionage Act, but he's not actually accused of espionage as we usually understand it. Espionage is when you secretly take government information and channel it to a foreign power in secret to benefit that power. Julian did the opposite. He received information from a journalistic source and he published it to the public. And this was important information that was of historical, legal, political importance, and that had an extraordinary impact. And for that, Julian was awarded the highest prizes journalism has globally. He won the Australian equivalent of the Pulitzer Prize, the Walkley Award, and he won the various journalism awards here in the UK and internationally as well, and the Sydney Peace Prize, because there was a recognition that Julian's publications about the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan had significantly impacted the course of those wars.
We got Ben Norton in the house. Ben is in Nicaragua and has been very busy as elections are approaching there. So he was a little late. He had, I think, a better excuse than I did the last time I was late because I was locked out of my house and had to break in. But Ben's here with us, and welcome, Ben.
Thanks. It's a pleasure to be here. And just to continue that thread, Stella, I'm wondering if you could talk about the most recent hearing, which was October 27th. There was a 2-day hearing, and the U.S. lawyer's argument was essentially that, or rather the representative for the U.S., the lawyer representing the U.S., the argument was essentially that Julian Assange should be extradited because the expert testimony was not legitimate, because the expert testimony, which talked about the very real threats to Julian's mental health and the very real possibility of suicide or death in the U.S. prison system, essentially the attorney representing the U.S. was trying to discredit that expert witness by saying that the expert witness is unreliable because the expert didn't mention you. So I'm wondering if you could respond to the most recent hearing and the arguments of the representatives of the U.S.
Well, there are different aspects to this. Firstly, to say it's completely absurd that we're even sitting and talking about these issues because basically the UK courts seem very comfortable when they're talking about everything but the political aspect of the case. When we were going through the long extradition hearing at the lowest court last year, the US was trying to exclude evidence from, for example, Khalid al-Masri, who was one of the rendition victims that was able to use WikiLeaks publications in his court cases in order to win at the European Court of Human Rights. And they were desperate to exclude that evidence from being aired in court, precisely because it was so embarrassing to the United States. And in fact, I think before Majid Khan aired his testimony about CIA torture in, I think, a New York court last week, or at least it was reported last week, I saw. I think Khalid al-Masri's evidence in Julian's extradition hearing last year was the first time that a torture rendition victim was able to confront the United States with his torture, because the U.S. has been able to exclude that forum in every other instance, and so this was hugely significant. And al-Masri wanted to be able to speak about his torture, and to be able to speak about how significant the WikiLeaks publications that Julian is being prosecuted over were for him to be able to achieve justice. So really, like, we should never lose perspective of what this case is really about. But it is true that the UK and the US have a highly restrictive extradition treaty, which restricts the UK's ability to bar extradition under very limited grounds. And one of those grounds is what they call oppression. And that is what they have found to be the reason to block this extradition, because an extradition would be oppressive. And the lowest court judge found that if Julian were to be extradited, that would lead to his death. She was convinced, after hearing expert testimony from numerous experts to that effect, that they had assessed Julian over a period of time, and there was no doubt in their mind. And there are several aspects that play into that. It's not about Julian saying, "Oh, I'll commit suicide." It is about Julian's state of health that has been deteriorating steadily while he was in the embassy. Towards the end of being in the embassy, it was a horrendous atmosphere that was deliberately trying to suffer him out of the embassy, so they wouldn't have to do what they ended up doing, which is expelling him, because that came at a political cost for Ecuador. And then once he was in Belmarsh High Security Prison, obviously his health has deteriorated at a much faster rate, especially during the periods that he's been in isolation. And so there's a very detailed, documented record of his deterioration. And another aspect is that he's been diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder, and that means that the risk of suicide, I think, is 8 times higher. And thirdly, the overwhelmingly likely conditions, certain conditions, as far as the experts during the extradition case gave their testimony. And also the US government admits that Julian would be placed in isolation in conditions of basically solitary confinement, because that's what the US does, especially in national security cases. And so that was the finding of the lowest court. And that was what the US government was appealing to the High Court, which is the second level court in the UK. And so it was very limited scope for the hearing. But during this time, there have been some new reports, and they were able to be introduced into the proceedings as well. We don't know when the judgment will come down. We think it's a matter of weeks rather than months. but that's just guesswork.
Am I correct that I don't know if it was the judge or the prosecution. I think it was the prosecution referring to some kind of solitary recreation that could be promised Julian if he were extradited to a supermax prison. That they,
Yeah, I mean, they were. It felt like they were being facetious when they were talking about how Julian would be perfectly fine in his cell for 22 hours a day or 23 hours a day, and then have recreation in a separate cell. He would be able to communicate, they said, with other prisoners through the pipes, and he could crochet in his cell. It's like they were making a big joke out of all of this, and I really experienced it as such a violation and an abuse. It's just a further dehumanization, and they've taken Julian's suffering. When you take when you look at what they did with Ellsberg, the plumbers tried to steal his psychiatrist's notes in order to use his well, private life and mental health against him. But through the process, and that's what made his case collapse. But if you look at what the US has done here, it's basically done the same, but aired it in court, and is now trying to undermine it. This suffering that the US government has inflicted over so many years, they're now taking that and turning it upside down, laughing at his suffering, laughing at his likely suicide. We were sitting there for 2 days talking about whether he could be committing suicide or not, and it was just it's hard to describe. It just it's so cruel. The whole process is just so cruel. And Julian sat there for a few hours on the first day. He had asked to come to court, but the court had refused his physical presence. And then he was over video link on a higher medication, and just couldn't follow. And after I don't know how long, maybe an hour and a half, he just wasn't. He was actually in the video room because Belmarsh prison didn't get the memo that the judges didn't require him to be there. He wanted to leave, but the Belmarsh didn't let him leave the video room, so he was just sitting there, not being able to follow anything, just trying to prop himself, his head up, because he couldn't follow anything. He couldn't stay alert or take anything in. And what he was hearing was this absurd exposition by the US, discussing his isolation in a US prison, and that he would live through this torture, basically describing the torturous conditions that he would live in, and discussing his suicide.
And so just to reinforce this insane episode, or to just clarify, the prosecutor, this is James Lewis, was detailing the torturous conditions that Julian would be held in a supermax prison as something that should be welcomed by the judge as humane conditions, because he would be able to communicate with other prisoners through pipes and crochet, would do 23 hours a day in solitary with 1 hour of some kind of confined recreation. It almost sounds like they're taunting Julian and his family. This sounds completely sadistic. Were they taunting, or what? Are they so delusional and so sociopathic that they actually thought that this was a good case for his extradition? I mean, I'm just stunned at what you just described. It's just shocking to me, the mentality of the prosecutors.
It is shocking, and it did feel like they were taunting. And when they brought up crochet, it's hard to interpret it as anything other than that. But I just see this as they're mercenaries, and to a degree, I think the people who are driving this in the DOJ are also just mercenaries. They're trying to advance their career. They're not thinking of the bigger political consequences. It's a big case, and they don't really hold themselves responsible for what happens to Julian.
They're just following orders, as we say.
That's right.
Which, I mean, as the Nuremberg trials established, is not actually a legitimate argument.
Right. Well, hopefully they'll be on trial in some alternate universe. Ben, I don't know if you have a question.
Yeah, Stella, there have been media reports in the past several days of you saying that you have been afraid that the CIA might actually hurt you in some way, or potentially something even worse. We've known for the past 2 years, but we have mainstream media acknowledgement from Yahoo News, from a journalist who's very close to U.S. intelligence agencies, admitting that the CIA discussed potentially killing Julian Assange when he was in the Ecuadorian embassy, where the United Nations working group established that he was being arbitrarily detained. And we know that the CIA also discussed poisoning him, kidnapping him. You have also said that you have feared that you and your family, your 2 children you have Assange, could also be targets. I don't want to try to open any wounds, but just I think it's important to talk about the other people, not just Assange, but people around Assange who are potentially being threatened just for speaking out on this important case. Do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, sorry. What we've seen is really extraordinary. So just to go back a bit, Julian was arrested on the 11th of April, 2019, and he's been in Belmarsh prison ever since. And after he was arrested, something important and interesting happened and started, I think, started a snowball, which is that several whistleblowers then came forward. These whistleblowers were working in the security company that was providing, well, ostensibly providing security to the embassy where Julian was for 7 years, in the Ecuadorian embassy. And they went to the Spanish press. They went initially, and then they went to Spanish police and provided a trove of data. And over the following months, an investigating judge, a senior investigating judge in Madrid, opened an investigation, and that investigation has been going now for over 2 years. There are 2 people indicted and charged. One is the CEO of that security firm, and the other one is the chief of operations. And through that investigation, we learned, and also through these whistleblowers and all the data they provided, that Julian was being targeted, and the people around him, specifically his lawyers and me and our 6-month-old baby and my mother, we were being targeted by name. We were being followed. Julian's lawyers were being also targeted by name. They had documents stolen, photographed, and so on. This was extraordinary. It's not just a case of an embassy having a closed circuit video television installed. This was audio recordings, microphones under fire extinguishers, hidden microphones being shipped off to the United States. And Max wrote an excellent summary of excellent piece about this investigation. So what we had as soon as Julian went into the embassy was the implementation of these highly sophisticated targeted operation. And the people who were carrying out this operation were saying that they were working for the CIA. But we didn't have any proof, any, at that point, link from the information that they had initially brought to the Spanish court. The link to the CIA was missing. But now, just recently, there was this story in Yahoo News, and it has the other side, the planning side to it. And so we had information about how they were discussing within the security company how to poison Julian and how to deniably allow him to be kidnapped from the embassy by leaving the door open and him just disappearing. We had that since 2019, and now you have this other element that the US was planning, was sketching. The CIA had, under Mike Pompeo, had tasked the agency to produce what they called sketches and options about how to assassinate Julian. This was in 2017 and 2018. And so the timeline matches exactly with the company that was working in the embassy, with Mike Pompeo's tenure as CIA director. So it's an extraordinary thing. You usually would never expect to hear or find out about the plots that were being planned against a CIA target. But here we have both the kind of implementing side and the planning side. And this is because whistleblowers, sources who are deeply uncomfortable with what was going on, have started to come out. And I think this is just the beginning.
Yeah, and we saw some of the staffers from UC Global, the firm, the Spanish security firm that was being obviously now used by the CIA to target Julian, everyone around him, as they pretended to run security for the Ecuadorian embassy on behalf of Ecuador's security services. They came out in the Spanish National Court and basically said that there were discussions of assassinating Julian Assange. That was what I reported based on testimony and internal communications from UC Global back in May of last year. So that's what Isikoff and his team at Yahoo News essentially confirmed with comments from CIA officers, both current and former, that Pompeo now wants to prosecute. And there's two dimensions. I mean, we should talk about the language Pompeo used about WikiLeaks, but first there's something I've wanted to ask you, which is that the one staffer described confronting you, if I'm correct, on a street and informing you that he was told to steal your son's diaper out of a trash can in order to determine if it was yours and Julian's son through the DNA, which is weird on so many levels. It suggests they had Julian's DNA because there was no discussion of getting his DNA. And you can't get DNA from feces. So anyway, he had basically had enough of all these orders he was getting, and he confronted you on a street and basically disclosed to you that there was a plot, an intelligence plot. Is that correct? And if so, I mean, what was that like? What was the next course of action for you?
Well, I had been bringing Gabriel in for the first 6 months of his life, and that's our eldest son. And the way for Julian to be able to see our son was that I asked a friend of mine to come in and pretend that it was his. And he was coming in to give Chinese lessons. Obviously, the UC Global staff were suspicious and tried repeatedly to get his Gabriel's, passports and so on. And we just said he doesn't have one because he's just a few months old, and why would you want that, right? So then they took it to the next level and tried to harvest his DNA. The security staff guy came up to me when I had left the embassy one day to buy lunch, and took me to one side and said, you know, we're being asked to do some very strange things. You know, be careful, and you shouldn't bring that baby in. And I just said, you know, what baby, kind of thing. and he was like, no, seriously, it's not safe. We've been asked to steal a diaper to get the DNA, and you shouldn't bring him in anymore. And at that point, this was December 2017. At that point, I realized, well, I always knew that the situation was precarious, but at that point, I realized that things were very creepy and sinister. And it just, I mean, mind you, this was a whole year and 4 months before Julian was expelled. So you can just imagine, like, this just escalated over time. From I'd say December was really tense to December 2017. But it just kind of got really vicious inside that embassy. And I didn't bring Gabriel in after that point. And it's terrible, you know. Julian wasn't able to see his son because of this insane situation that we found ourselves in until Belmarsh.
Yeah, and so it was a sort of psychological terror in addition to all the surveillance in order to isolate him. And then there was the revelation by a former business associate of UC Global of David Morales, who's sort of on trial in Spain, except the US DOJ refuses to cooperate, so nothing can go forward. But this person said Morales proposed an assassination. Obviously, he was getting those orders from elsewhere, but that would seem to and the you know, no one. I reported that, okay, and I reported it at the Gray Zone. On Wikipedia, we're considered a deprecated source because a bunch of neocons who Jimmy Wales has installed as editors or blessed as editors have decided, because we report too many inconvenient facts. So the Gray Zone, it wasn't enough for us to report that. It required a mainstream media organization to come forward and confirm all of this, which was just using like primary sources, testimonies, internal communications. It wasn't really conjecture. But now that it's just so confirmed, it has really become part of the case. It has worked its way into the hearings. And I just wanted to ask you about a very unusual comment by the judge. If I'm getting this right, the judge said, well, obviously the CIA has an interest in Julian Assange. I mean, it was much more than an interest there. But
He said something like intense interest.
Yeah, I mean, how is the judge, in your view, reacting to the confirmation of this assassination plot? Is this an attempt to sort of downplay and dismiss what was taken? I mean, there are several judges, but how do you receive this kind of language or interpret it?
I don't think I can really state my opinion.
Understandable.
But
Maybe I phrased the question wrong.
no, the Julian's barrister was very strong. He's a kind of the advocate in court who actually presents the arguments, Mark Summers, and he quickly responded saying, this isn't about an intense interest. This is about the CIA's plans to seriously harm Julian. And then he was able to talk about specifically what those serious ways to harm Julian entailed. And sorry. And the judge didn't stop him from detailing those things. So I think it was important. And, you know, the British courts are very uncomfortable when things are political in a case. And this is a political case, and they are deeply uncomfortable whenever we're talking about the political aspects of this case. And if we lose, if the US wins this appeal, then all the political aspects of this case will be back center stage in the courtroom. So,
yeah. And the prosecutor, for those who don't know, is a barrister named James Lewis, who he's like the establishment's man. He defended the British soldier who killed John Pat Cunningham during the Troubles in Ireland. Basically, clear case of a soldier shooting someone in the back, and he was brought in. He was also, I think, involved in some prosecutions around the Falklands War. So it really does seem to be that the British establishment has cohered around this case, while they are increasingly isolated and the case has fallen apart. I mean, I don't know what kind of argument they can make about the U.S. receiving Julian and providing him a free and fair trial when his attorneys were spied on by UC Global CIA assets, when there was a discussion of assassinating him by the very government that's seeking him. And given the state of the US prison system, where people in supermax prisons are tortured on a daily basis, as well as his mental state. But there's also the issue of Siggy Thordarson, who is the main witness in the Espionage Act indictment, who is admitted that he lied and was lying to get out of a sex offense case. To what extent was this this component of the collapse of Julian's prosecution a factor in the hearings?
well, it wasn't dealt with at this stage of the appeal, because the basically the CIA story was able to be introduced because of the CIA's role in determining Julian's conditions once he's extradited. The Sigurdur Thordarson revelation hasn't been able to be aired in court because it wasn't part of the appeal point, which was oppression, specifically in relation to Julian's mental health. If we lose this appeal, then that is a very important new component that directly impacts the case in general. I mean, the Thordarson, just to go back a bit, the Yahoo story is interesting because it sets out a timeline. It sets out a timeline that Pompeo came in, was looking at ways to kill Julian, looking at ways to kidnap Julian from the embassy and rendition him. And then there were some components of the US government, of the US executive, that saw that this was a completely illegal and insane thing that Pompeo was planning. And then, so there was a disagreement within the US government. And I think it's really important when we talk about the US government, we talk about the UK establishment and so on, we have to remember that there are actually different factions. There's disagreements, and that's important that there are these disagreements. We're not dealing with a homogenous mass, because it means that Julian's case can be dropped if the right factions are empowered enough, if they're getting the right signals from the electorate, from the public, from the media, and so on. So it's important to always keep in mind that there are different factions. And but what happened then? So these factions then pressured the DOJ to issue an indictment. And obviously, that's not supposed to happen. There's supposed to be a separation of powers. And I think that the US is quite unusual in that it has a highly politicized Department of Justice. I mean, just the FBI's relationship with the DOJ and the CIA's relationship with the DOJ. It's just it's a lot more. It's a lot closer than other systems. And I mean, for example, Bill Barr. Bill Barr used to be a CIA officer, actually. Then he became a CIA lawyer and defended the CIA before the Church Commission and sorry, I forget the other one. And then
Iran-Contra, he helped basically get all the Iran-Contra felons off. He wrote their pardons.
Right.
After fighting as a young man, fighting attempts to reform the CIA following the revelations of the Phoenix program, assassination program in Vietnam, and so many other scandals. So yeah, that's a great point. The DOJ is really part of the national security state in the US.
Yeah. And Bill Barr is the Attorney General who brought the the first superseding indictment against Julian, which escalated from one 5-year charge, one charge that carried a 5-year sentence to 18 charges, 17 of them under the Espionage Act for publishing true information to the public. And so, this Barr is still a creature of the CIA. He's still on the advisory board of, sorry, I can't remember exactly, but he's still formally associated to the CIA. And so what this indictment that we see is a construct that is born out of what the CIA was trying to do to Julian. It is unprecedented and dangerous because of the press freedom precedent, the attack on press freedom, the precedent it sets that can be used against anyone if the government so chooses. And that's the first time that they've gotten away with this. And if they do get away with it, they can deploy it again and again and again. And it's not just against Julian. They've been trying to do this for years and years. You'll remember that James Rosen was described as a co-conspirator with his source at the State Department, an unindicted co-conspirator, which means they could have just indicted him. So they've been experimenting with this possibility of prosecuting journalists for doing their job for years and years. And the CIA story also went into some detail about how the U.S. government under Obama was looking to designate Laura Poitras and Glenn Greenwald as information brokers, essentially the same thing as what Pompeo later did with this designation, non-state hostile intelligence service. And what that did was basically create an internal term that allowed the CIA to make these plans and carry out operations without congressional oversight and without presidential sign-off. It's just like this secret society, these internal rules that the CIA has developed in order to be completely unaccountable and get away with murder, literally. But I just want to go into this non-state hostile intelligence service just for a
Please,
minute.
please
I mean,
do.
if let's break it down, right? Non-state, what does that actually mean? It means, well, independent.
Independent media.
Right. Hostile. Well, hostile to what? Hostile to US interests? I mean, the world is not the United States. There are different countries with different interests, but we're not even talking about a state entity. We're talking about a journalistic entity that is critical, basically. Hostile equals critical. So we've got independent critical intelligence service, aka journalistic outfit, right? They just basically securitized an independent critical journalistic outfit, and turned these terms into national security threats. That kind of took it to an extreme.
Yeah,
But what
just
it's also
using language to create political space for assassination.
with
I mean,
legal implications. This is very similar to what they did with, enhanced interrogation techniques, right? You don't call it torture. That means a whole different set of rules apply. This is the same idea. But apart from that, I mean, I just find it incredible that the cognitive dissonance between having Pompeo announcing non-state hostile intelligence agency. This is the CIA, right? The CIA does lots of things. It tortures, it murders, and so on. But it's also an intelligence agency. So their role is to actually find out whether, who's a spy, who isn't. And so by April 2017, when Pompeo made this speech, he revealed to the world that the CIA's conclusion when it came to WikiLeaks was that they weren't Russian agents. It's in the title, non-state hostile intelligence service, right? At the same time, the CIA was planting, and it's in that CIA story, propaganda, planting stories, feeding the Russiagate narrative because it suited their purposes. Their purposes were to attack WikiLeaks, to imprison Julian or kill him, to weaken the organization, to weaken, to impede its ability to publish, as in retaliation, as revenge over Vault 7, which was published under the Trump presidency, one of the first publications that WikiLeaks published once Trump got in. And so the CIA was basically weaponized Russiagate and fed this narrative they knew was false. Like, if anyone in the US was in charge of knowing whether WikiLeaks and Julian were Russian agents or whatever, it's the CIA. And they concluded that he wasn't and that WikiLeaks wasn't. And then they announced it, but they still fed this narrative and created complete political chaos and social chaos in the United States for years. And we still see that, and just fed this market that opened up about this enormous conspiracy theory that was completely baseless.
Can I interrupt really quickly? Because you referred
Yeah.
to the CIA feeding stories. Let me I can't believe this story is still up there. It still exists. But I mean, was this one of the stories by Luke Harding? The Manafort held secret talks with Assange in Ecuadorian embassy. Sources say this story's been proven to be false. Manafort denied it. There's no record that anyone has of them being there. WikiLeaks denied it, but it's still up, and it's coming from Ecuadorian sources that come very close to being U.S. intelligence assets. I mean, I don't want to get into any details. Was this one of the stories, or which stories are you referring to?
I mean, this is the most famous one, but there were, huge amounts of almost on a daily basis, and they were retracted. And then the next one came out, and then it had to be, countered and then retracted. And who could keep up? Only only WikiLeaks and about maybe 100 people were actually keeping up, keeping the record straight, because it was just a a strategy of attack, and then the public doesn't have time or the resources or they have lives to live, and can't keep up with what was an enormous strategy to discredit Julian, to try to place an enormous question mark over his motives and his associations and so on. But in fact, the CIA revealed what it had concluded and announced it: non-state hostile intelligence service, i.e., independent media organization that is critical of U.S. policy at times when the information, when
it makes a serious impact.
Well,
I mean,
yeah.
you could define the gray zone the same way. I guess we just haven't made enough of an impact. We got to try harder.
Well, yeah. And Stella, there's a few points I want to respond to, especially on this topic of how the specificity of language is very important and how we can sometimes look over these terms. But really quickly, I just wanted to say, well, Max is on the point, not to belabor this point, but I'll say that a top-level former Ecuadorian government official told me that he thinks it's very likely that Manafort story came from SENAIN, which is the Ecuadorian intelligence services that were working with the CIA to spy on Assange, and that SENAIN was the linking point between the UC Global firm that the CIA was spying on, which was writing these reports using SENAIN's intelligence, which was in fact CIA intelligence. But a lot of it was also just bogus intelligence that SENAIN was feeding to the Moreno government, the Lenin Moreno government, because they just wanted to tell Moreno what he wanted to hear, which is what the US wanted to hear. And I just want to point out that Moreno was so disgraced by the SENAIN intelligence agency that he actually disbanded it because it was just proven to be so farcical, so fraudulent, and everything they did was either completely false or was just taken from the CIA that he was forced to dissolve it. But anyway, a point that I wanted to emphasize, you mentioned how when Pompeo gave that speech, which it was at a think tank, actually, which is interesting. It shows the revolving doors between DC think tanks and the US government itself. But when Pompeo gave that speech referring to WikiLeaks as a non-state hostile intelligence agency, a lot of people didn't think twice necessarily about what he said, not realizing the legal precedent that he set. Well, another term that we know that the CIA was using in a similar way, another euphemism that they have been using to try to reclassify journalists, is information broker. We know that because of the Yahoo News investigation, that the CIA referred to journalists and WikiLeaks supporters and WikiLeaks employees as, quote, information brokers, to try to take away the label journalist so they can relabel them something that they themselves termed, so they can then criminalize being an information broker. And we saw in that Yahoo News story, again, I mean, Max reported this over a year and a half ago, so a lot of what we know from the story isn't necessarily new, but something that they acknowledged in this Yahoo News story is, I'm just going to read this passage here, that agency executives, that's of course CIA executives, quote, requested and received sketches of plans for killing Assange and other Europe-based WikiLeaks members who had access to Vault 7 materials, said a former intelligence official. So the important point there is that the CIA is relabeling journalists information brokers and admitting that they received sketches of plans for killing not just Assange, but, quote, Europe-based WikiLeaks members. I mean, this seems to be not only is the case against Assange an incredible new, brave new world in terms of trying to prosecute journalists, but renaming journalists information brokers and making plans to kill them. Oh, admittedly, I mean, that's something well beyond violating freedom of the press and freedom of speech. That's violating freedom to live. I don't know if you can comment on this, but this seems so Orwellian.
I think part of the problem is that we're dealing with incredibly powerful organizations that have incredibly powerful tools. It's not just the CIA. I mean, what does that even mean, information broker, in the era of information? Think about what social media organizations are doing. I mean, I think there's a very good case to be made that they are information brokers, right? They can censor. They're completely unaccountable. We don't know when we're shadow banned, etc. They can direct information to people's accounts and suppress information. And we are under the illusion that it is some kind of public space, but it's not. It's an intermediated space. And traditional journalism is perceived by the powerful as an incredible threat. And what does that mean? Do we really have the tools to be able to counter these incredibly powerful organizations? I mean, we're talking about press freedom, but it feels like things are well beyond that point. I mean, the US was planning to assassinate a journalist. Saudi did that with Khashoggi in their consulate in Turkey. But the US was doing the same at the same time, planning to do against Julian, because he published information that embarrassed the US government. And I think they're just so far gone, and we're kind of clinging to these old concepts and these old rights that are incredibly weak at this point. Because of what I've experienced personally. Maybe I feel it more acutely, but I think everyone is kind of in the same boat right now, and we're in a very dangerous state, and we're descending into a more and more dangerous state. And the protections that we've relied on, we refer to, the Pentagon Papers and so on, but that was 50 years ago, and there's a lot of rights that have been undone over the past 20 years, and we haven't gained any ground. We've just lost ground, and we're losing ground on a more and more accelerated pace. And Julian's case is kind of emblematic of this shift. And whether he wins or loses this kind of charts where we're at, and whether we can regain any ground or not. So this is about Julian, saving Julian's life. And it's about a lot more than that.
Absolutely. There's a great piece out by John Reese today. I'll throw it up on the screen. And I want to read a passage from it and get your response. He calls the Assange appeal the defining trial of our time. And I tend to agree. It's certainly the press freedom trial of the century. And, a lot of NGOs, press freedom NGOs and human rights NGOs, to me, they've been kind of asleep as this persecution developed. But now they're finally starting to speak up because I think they see what's at stake. Outside the courts, Reese writes, that balance of the argument has swung Assange's way. Amnesty International, the American Civil Liberties Union, Human Rights Watch, and practically every human rights organization on the planet is calling for the end to this extradition. So is the National Union of Journalists, its Australian equivalent. Assange is an Australian citizen who's been, in my view, betrayed by his government, and the International Federation of Journalists. So are parliamentarians across the globe. So is the UN. By the way, not parliamentarians here. Haven't heard much from the squad. So is the UN. So are many of the major newspapers in the UK, even those who have been hostile in the past. Only the core of the political establishment remains obdurate. The Tory cabinet, the Labour leadership, the BBC, entranced as ever by the special relationship with the US. To what extent can this development affect the outcome of Julian's prosecution?
You mean all the
The
major?
fact that these groups are finally speaking up. I mean,
I think it has a huge impact, and these organizations, some are braver than others, and they really depend on who is in charge. And there are staff changes, so sometimes there's movement all of a sudden in an organization that has been dormant for a long time, and they're also constrained, let's be real, by their funding sources. But there is kind of they're also, they're looking at what their peers are doing. And they're also sensitive to criticism over not being active on a certain case. So to the viewers, I urge them, if you're part of an organization and it hasn't taken a stance, the easiest way to get them to do something is to roll out the list of the ACLU and Amnesty and so on, and saying, why are you the outliers? Why should I be supporting you?
Cough, cough, index on censorship.
Why aren't you on that list? And why should I be bringing my money to you and not to them? So they're very sensitive to this kind of thing, especially when the big players are very strong. Amnesty has been very strong. They still haven't designated him a prisoner of conscience. I hope that's just a matter of time. Reporters Without
Borders, he needs to be
Borders,
Russian, maybe.
It's very interesting to see, speculate what kind of constraints internally there might be when something's so obvious. Similarly to the Nobel Peace Prize, there's a lot of criticism actually in Norway. All the major mainstream papers are carrying opinion pieces and articles about how Julian should have been, at the very least, the third recipient. And that's been ever since the Nobel Peace Prize was announced. There has been a steady publication of articles making that point. So I think it's at this stage, it's just it's carrying itself. This case, there are enough people who are now understand the case or sufficiently informed about the case.
Here's the Nobel Prize winner. Sorry to interrupt. Anyway, you were saying.
Yeah, that I think there's a critical mass, basically, of civil society organizations, the big players that are squarely on Julian's side, that have denounced this prosecution. And so the US and the UK and Australia, they're on the back foot. And they just yesterday, I think, issued a statement, Media Freedom, whatever coalition, about the persecution of journalists and so on. And I think it's because they're scared. They set up this whole Media Freedom Initiative to coincide with Julian's arrest from the embassy, I think because they understood that they would be under attack for what they were doing to Julian, for imprisoning him, for prosecuting him. And so they set up this Media Freedom Initiative, invite a lot of organizations every year to talk about media freedom, and they issue statements just after Julian's hearings. But I see this as a sign of weakness because they know that they don't control the narrative. Because, you can issue press releases, but when you have court hearings airing the extraordinary abuse of process, the attack on press freedom, the attack on the public's right to know, the punishment of Julian for exposing war crimes and human rights abuses and torture and rendition. You cannot counter that with some press releases. They're attacking much more fundamental principles and values that go to the core of what people who want to live in a free and fair society value. And so, it might have worked for a few weeks in the beginning, but at this stage, Julian's persecution is so clear for everyone to see. He's been in a high security prison for 2.5 years. He's not convicted of anything. And the US is trying to put him in prison for the rest of his life for some of the most important publications in journalistic history that everyone agrees were hugely impactful, that changed the course of history, that allowed for accountability, for court cases to be taken, for victims to receive restitution, and so on. I mean, the scale of the impact of the 2010 Chelsea Manning publications is just enormous, and everyone acknowledges that, and that's what they're going after him for. So, you can't. The case is just too big, and it's too interwoven with history to try to suppress it with some press releases. It's just deflection, and it's not working.
Thanks for staying with us for so long, Stella. I have one or two questions, if that's all right, and I'm sure Ben might have one. I wanted to ask about the Russia issue that you brought up. It was inserted into the chronicle of events detailed by Isikoff and his sources, his CIA sources, and they invoked this scenario of a shootout with Russian agents transporting Assange to escape at the airport. I don't know how much credibility there is to that, but there's also the story that we've been hearing ever since the Russiagate saga, that Russia was the source of the DNC emails and so on. And we learned that allegedly Trump sent representatives, Dana Rohrabacher, to offer Julian a pardon if he would give up his source and prove that there was no Russia tie. And he refused because he doesn't give up sources like all good journalists. Why would he not trade his source for his freedom and just prove once and for all that Russia was not the source and that he wasn't colluding with Russia, which would have taken off the table this entire narrative?
Well, Julian is very principled, and he would never give up a source, even if it was to gain freedom. Supposedly, he's not that kind of person. The whole Russiagate thing is, I mean, it's never had legs to stand on. The Mueller report, the part that pertained to WikiLeaks, was unredacted quietly, I think the day before the 2020 election, to say that there was no evidence to bring any case because they weren't able to, because there was no knowledge, or they couldn't show anything. They couldn't even show that this Guccifer 2 figure was the source of WikiLeaks publications. There is basically just conjecture, and they were able to spin that conjecture for years and years until they had to produce reports and then say, well, actually, we didn't come up with anything. But anyway, but I mean, I think the important thing well, there are several takeaways from this, which is that you can create a whole market to basically play on people's fears and political allegiances and take them further and further away from reality. And that's really quite frightening. The second point is that, regardless of who WikiLeaks source was, and Julian has said it wasn't Russia, there were dozens of US outlets, The Hill and The Intercept and many others, who were in fact sourcing from Guccifer 2. And, that is normal. And if, that's that. The US was singling WikiLeaks out and playing on this conjecture that Guccifer 2 was WikiLeaks' source. But I mean, the response to that is, what if, so what? Because it was the source for The Intercept, it was the source for The Hill, it was the source for dozens of other US organizations that were directly communicating with Guccifer 2. And, the New York Times said that if they had received the DNC material, they would have published it, and so on. So it's really just playing on people's fears and frustrations for the people who were voting for Hillary Clinton, and kind of deepening that divide and allowing this false narrative to fester, basically, and to create a huge division and confrontation within the United States. And I think there's a lot of responsibility on these journalists who are basically unaccountable. They write books. They wrote books that have been disproved, but they sold a lot of copies, and the public has been misled, and it's criminal, frankly. I mean, not criminal because I'm not suggesting they should be criminalized, but it's deeply, deeply unethical, and has real consequences in the social fabric of the United States.
Ben, I don't know if there's anything you want to ask in closing.
Well, no, I just want to underscore how important this case is. I, as a journalist, feel so strongly that everyone should be speaking out for Julian Assange. And it's become so clear that this case is so ridiculous on so many levels, from the CIA spying and threats against him, from the fact that the US government's chief source for these accusations against Assange, the source was totally discredited, admitted that he made things up, and is also a pedophile. I mean, there's just so many levels of disgrace to this case, and I really want to thank Stella for coming on and giving us an hour of your time to talk about it. And I know, Max, you said you had another question, so maybe you can wrap up the interview here.
Well, just in closing, I mean, how is Julian doing, and what kind of interactions have you had?
Well, it's very difficult. It's very hard for him because there's no end in sight, and he's in this horrible place, and he's far from home. But we're able to see him regularly, and so we have regular contact, and when he sees the kids, he's able to hold them, and they sit on his lap, and he's able to read stories to them, and so on. But it's brief, but it's a lifeline. I was meant to see him this morning. I went to Belmarsh, and there was some bureaucratic issue, and they didn't bring him to the meeting room, so I sat there for an hour, hoping he'd be brought down, but he wasn't. So, I mean, these kinds of frustrations are just part of the day-to-day situation.
Well, clearly you and the whole family are under an enormous amount of pressure, but you've continued to keep us informed and keep the momentum going for Julian's freedom. So you have all our admiration, and thank you so much for spending so much time with us and informing our audience. We have a lot of engagement right now. A lot of people watching. So this was definitely very worthwhile. If there's anything anyone can do or keep their eyes on, maybe you could let our audience know right now before we move on.
Well, you can donate to Julian's defense. The U.S. Actually gets to extradite Julian for free. The UK taxpayer foots that bill, and Julian has to raise money to be able to confront the U.S. Abusive case every step of the way. So that's a very significant contribution that people can make. And I have a follow my Twitter account, Stella Moris with 1 R and then 1 at the end, the numeral 1. And I post, good source, like good information that I recommend people read, and also how to donate. I have a pinned tweet. And there are other ways if people want to do tax deductible donations in the US, that's also possible. Just DM me and we can find a way for that to happen. And then secondly, contact your representatives because they care about their re-election. And if you have a small business, a cafeteria, bar, whatever, shop, try to gather signatures that you can then take to your representatives to show that people care about this case. Inform and engage your networks, your friends, your family. What it takes, that's what it takes to get people to care about this case and to understand that an innocent man is being crucified and that he might die and that all our futures depend on his freedom.
Absolutely. Stella Moris, lawyer, fiancée of Julian Assange, thanks so much for joining Moderate Rebels.
Thank you.
So, free Julian Assange,
that's not all.
defund the CIA.
Yeah.